In 1895, Japan acquired Taiwan Island from the Qing Empire. Japan would then cede it along with the rest of their short-lived colonial empire at the end of World War II in 1945. Over those 50 years, the Japanese left a lasting legacy on the island. They conducted its first geological survey, sorted out property rights, built up a taxpayer base, and eradicated several diseases. Their work transformed a violent, ethnically divided Qing dynasty frontier territory into a functioning state. Impressively, they performed this nation building as the Chinese nationalist government spasmed through power struggles, food shortages, and endemic poverty across the strait on the mainland. The contrast has always been fascinating to me. Mainland China squandered some of the richest, most fertile, and vibrant resources of any country. Meanwhile, the Kangxi Emperor called Taiwan a ball of mud. How did that ball of mud develop so well? Here we look at colonial Taiwan's early economy and how it developed under Japanese influence. At the turn of the 20th century, Japan sought to enter the ranks of the European colonizing nations. The way they saw it, it was either to colonize or to be colonized. This meant that Japan had to acquire some colonies of their own. However, the Japanese economy at the time could not support expensive colonial acquisition forays far from home. Not to mention that most of the land in traditional areas like Africa and Latin America had already been spoken for. Thus, the Japanese looked across the Sea of Japan towards Korea. By many criteria, Korea would make for a poor Japanese colony. The Korean kingdom was relatively sophisticated and possessed a coherent identity, a distinct nation of peoples led by a king. Not to mention that Korea usually allied itself with its much larger neighbor to the north, China. But Qing China's decline as a world power would in turn destabilize its neighbor. The Japanese government's biggest nightmare was to have an unstable, hostile Korea, or worse, one colonized by a Western power, lying across the Tsushima Straits from them. This laid the impetus for the Korean annexation in 1910, and in their minds justified a brutal, heavy-handed military rule. Korea's geopolitical importance gave the ruling colonial government justification to rebuff any calls from liberal voices back home to reform the colonization strategy. Taiwan, in contrast, did not face the same situation. Japan had first taken control of Taiwan Island after the Qing lost the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894. The island was at the time a largely unsettled, Wild West type frontier far from both China and Japan alike. The whole island had been not even completely pacified yet. Fierce aboriginal tribes and the Han settlers regularly clashed in the center and east. This helped Taiwan's Japanese rulers in two ways. First, they did not have to face a completely unified force nostalgic for their lost nation, unlike with Korea. Second, the lower strategic priority that the military assigned to Taiwan Island meant that its rulers were not hardline generals and were open to, relatively, more liberal policies. At the same time, this also meant that the Japanese had to do a lot of groundwork to build a functioning national economy out of this ball of mud. Japanese strategy positioned Taiwan's infrastructure and economy as a supplier of agricultural goods for the homeland, focusing on rice and sugar. Nothing about Taiwan's climate or soil makes it particularly well suited for growing such crops. Japan could have easily gotten sugar for much cheaper from Dutch-ruled Indonesia. But at the time, Japan was importing a considerable amount of sugar. Japanese rulers sought a self-sufficient source of the stuff. Taiwanese sugar would allow Japan to save its foreign exchange reserves for other imports, such as those needed for the industrialization process. Critically, Japan bought Taiwanese goods without competition. Taiwan's goods were exempt from Japanese tariffs. This created a captive market for Taiwan exports and jolted the economy, abruptly shifting it out of its former status as a neglected Qing province to a fully export-oriented economy. This meant that for the first couple decades, from 1911 to 1941, Taiwan's economy grew steadily from the business of export agriculture. Taiwan would eventually account for 92% of all of Japan's sugar supply and 36% of all of its rice supply as well. Between 1897 and 1908, Taiwan would accumulate a 34.5 million yen trade surplus through its captive export relationship with Japan, representing a large flow of capital transferring from Japan into Taiwan. While the Japanese government never really budged from its positioning of Taiwan as an agricultural breadbasket, in doing so, it nevertheless primed the economy to make the jump from agriculture to industrialization. This was further primed through the Japanese development of the Taiwanese people. As many gardeners know, it is less about the plot of land, but the effort put into it. With crops like rice, the more work you put into it, the more you get out of it. Thus, you need good workers. This meant that in order to build up Taiwan as Japan's food basket, Japan had to improve the health and lives of the Taiwanese living there, a concept economists would call improving human capital. This began with the public health system. Diseases like the plague and cholera were eliminated from society. These advances cut the death rate in half and sparked a baby boom. Taiwan's population mushroomed from 3.3 million to 6 million within 30 years. At the same time, the Japanese colonial government sought to educate the native people with the express philosophy of making the Taiwanese people more quote-unquote Japanese. They introduced large-scale primary education in the late 20s, raising the share of kids in primary school attendance from 20% to 71%. And this created a class of educated native people. In addition, Japan recruited Japanese from its homeland to immigrate to Taiwan, infusing it with specialized human capital. Some 20,000 Japanese technicians and white-collar managers were working in Taiwan by 1940, accounting for over 60% of its agricultural technicians. This two-pronged strategy of importing human capital to meet short-term needs while improving the wares of the native population for long-term benefit would in the end arm the economy for its future industrial development and growth. Taiwan's economy would make the transition from agriculture to industry with ease, thanks to these benefits. And lastly, we want to talk about money. In addition to the massive amount of Japanese capital transferred to Taiwan through its captive export relationships in sugar and rice, Taiwan also benefited from outright transfers of capital in not insignificant amounts. This began with a massive capital infusion in the first 2 years of Taiwanese colonization. 13 million yen, comprising over 50% of the Taiwan government's cash receipts. Japan, excited about its first colony, threw great financial resources into the effort. But for a country that itself was struggling to develop and industrialize, Japan found these capital subsidies quite burdensome, and the public attitude towards Taiwan turned unfavorable. This manifested in a broadly popular movement to sell Taiwan to France for 100 million yen in 1898. This eventually would not happen, but the popular pressure would force the colonial government to generate revenue on its own. The cash subsidies at the start, though, would help jumpstart the development process and get the Taiwan government going on a comprehensive land survey leading to a land tax, as well as profits from government-run monopolies. This left Taiwan with a largely corruption-free government able to pay its own bills and run its own affairs. Conclusion. Economic development is a melting pot of ingredients. It requires specialized human capital, favorable government policies, and an infusion of financial capital through exports or loans. Judged on human rights grounds, Japan's record in Taiwan is mixed. The brutal counterinsurgency against the Taiwanese Aboriginal population, the systematic racial subordination of the Taiwanese Han population, the lack of representation for all islanders in Taiwan, this all should not be forgotten and is a stain on the Japanese colonization period. Economically and developmentally, however, Japan gave a great deal to Taiwan during its colonial years. It is almost as if they wanted to be a European colonial power but had no idea how to do it. Well, like the Europeans did. So unlike with the European colonizations across Africa and Latin America, Japan infused millions into nation building, inadvertently gave the island a profitable agricultural export monopoly, and sent tens of thousands of their own people to work and build up the economy. The Japanese built their island into a nation, and the Taiwanese on a whole have good feelings about the Japanese occupation, setting the stage for the next period of its history.